So the key to making a proper head cut and tail cut for that matter is to set your saw at a 45-degree bevel and then verify from which side you need to enter the cut. So I'm going to turn my saw to a 45-degree bevel. So there's my setting of my saw at 45 degrees. You can see the blade is at a 45 degree relative to the shoe of the saw. So we have our saw set at our angle, and we just want to verify that it's going through at the proper bevel. If we were to go through the opposite side, you could see that the bevel would be cutting the wrong way. So we want to make sure and verify which way we start our cut or enter the cut. So for this compound cut, I've set my saw at a 45-degree bevel and I'm cutting at an angle on the edge of my board. This is one of the more complicated cuts that you'll ever have to make with a skill saw. One thing I recommend is holding the guard up with your thumb and keeping your fingers on top of the saw so that they're in a safe path. When you're making this cut, you just have to sight the line as best you can, and it may take a bite or two of the saw to get the proper direction to follow your line. And again, this just takes practice, so please have some patience and don't be afraid to make several practice cuts. We've now made half of our head cut of our hip rafter. We need to flip the rafter over and cut it again. So now you can see I've cut the one side, but I still have this line here, which is the other shoulder, the other side of my hip rafter head cut. This is the top end of my rafter. So I'll be cutting this line again at a 45-degree bevel. If you flipped your rafter over this way, you should be entering the cut from the same side as you did at the first cut. If you've done this cut correctly, you should have a pointed end of your rafter that fairly closely matches the top cut or the top marks that you made. We're now going to do the exact same process to the very tail of the rafter. There's our tail cut. I can now cut the head of my jack rafter. It is a single cut head cut for the jack rafter since it only has one through cut or one diagonal. My saw is still set to a 45-degree bevel, and I'll cut following my plumb line on the top end of my jack rafter. This is what the completed head cut of a jack rafter will look like. A 45-degree angle on the top and a common angle plumb cut on the face. I'm done with my bevel cuts for the time being, so I'm going to set my saw back to 0. Lock it down. I can now make the tail cut and the bird's mouth cuts for my hip and jack rafters. The bird's mouth cutout is exactly the same as the common rafter. Don't overcut, we'll finish the cut with our jigsaw. Here's our bottom end of our jack rafter. It's exactly the same as a common. So just to refresh, here is our bird's mouth for our hip rafter. I've marked my height above plate relative to the uphill plumb line that I marked. I'm going to cut my seat cut back to the very outside corner of the wall plate, that back line. So what I'm going to be cutting out will be that area there. Notice the difference between the bird's mouth and the tail cuts on the hip rafter and the jack rafter. The seat cut is at a different angle, it's at a shallower angle on the hip rafter because of how the hip rafter is placed. The jack rafter will be identical to your common rafters. The very outside corner of the hip rafter and the tail of the jack, again, similar to a common rafter. Head cuts, here's your hip rafter and here's your jack rafter. This happens to be a right-hand jack. Here's our mock-up that we will fit our hip and two jack rafters to. So let's go ahead and place our hip rafter in position. I'm going to put my outside corner so that it is centered on the outside corner. I'm just going to let it rest right up in the pocket up there. You'll note, okay, that we're right where we want to be on the uphill side, on the top end of our hip rafter, and we're nice and tight. If for some reason you're low up here, you can notch slightly up to 1/8 of an inch or so deeper this way to make slight adjustments that will raise the top end of your rafter if you need to adjust the fit at all. So if you'll notice this uphill line that I drew when I was laying out my bird's mouth, okay, that is where we measured the height above plate. And as you can see, that line directly intersects the face of my framing. Okay, that's why we marked that line on the top forward like we did, so that I knew the plane of the wall coming up the side of this rafter. That's also why we measured the height above plate at that point, because that's the plane of the top of the common and jack rafters, is at that point right there, the outside of this hip rafter. The theoretical length of our rafter was to this plane right here, the very outside corner of the wall plate. And when I marked my line straight across my board and dropped down, if you look in that pocket right there, you'll see that the outside corner tucks right into the center of my hip rafter. We needed to cut that seat cut all the way back to that point so we could slide our rafter far enough forward to get a proper placement. For our jack rafter layout, we'll lay out similar to how we lay out floor joists or any other on-center spaced framing members. We'll hook the outside of our wall plate, and we'll measure and we'll find our on-center mark. In this case, it's 16 inches. That represents the center of our, in this case, jack rafter. And I want to pull back 3/4 of an inch or half the thickness of my rafter and mark a line on the wall plate so that I know where to position my jack rafter. So my jack rafter will sit nestled up right to that line. So we'll place our jack rafter in position, and it will nest right up to the hip rafter, like so, so that the very outside corner of the hip is flush with the very top of our jack rafter. To locate the intersection of the jack rafter on the hip, we'll generally pull parallel to one of our king common rafters. For the mock-up here, we can simply measure the distance from the inside of our board to our mark on the wall plate, 8 inches, and transfer that line up to here and mark 8 inches right there. That will ensure that we'll parallel and square on our layout. And as you can see, the inside face of our jack rafter lines up very well with that mark. So with both jack rafters in place, they match up left and right side of our hip rafter.